I'm Nazir Khan. I'm a member of Twin Cities DSA. I'm also one of the co-founders of the Minnesota Environmental Justice Table. And yeah, like I said, this framework has been really important to our organizing at the table, and I hope more and more important to DSA. But yeah, just to introduce our speakers and maybe also just give an overview real quick. I think the way we're going to do this is some overview of the Red Deal from Nick Estes, and then I'm going to ask a few questions of both Nick and Joe, and also what I'm hoping to do as part of this is try to apply it to a local fight that I'm sure many people here are familiar with, the fight in East Phillips in Minneapolis for a visionary urban farm, and against the city's attempt to build a massive public works facility in one of the most overburdened communities in the state, an official environmental justice community. And I think there's a lot of interconnections, and I know Nick has gotten involved with this fight. Joe has been a critical leader, and so yeah, that's the hope. And then we are also going to try to have some discussion if we can do that. Would love for people to participate in the chat and put questions forward. I think Rob will be collecting those, and we'll pull from those and try to have after some of the questions and discussion between Nick and Joe and myself, have you all join the discussion as well, because we really want to turn this into some visioning and movement building, and hopefully this analysis can support the work we're doing on the ground in the Twin Cities and in Minnesota. And so, yeah, so Nick Estes, co-founder of the Red Nation. He's a faculty member in the American Indian Studies Department at the University of Minnesota. He's the author of Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance. And he is a member of the Lower Brule Sioux Nation. Joe Vital is a member of the Red Lake Ojibwe Nation. He's an environmental justice organizer, and he has been a key leader in the fight to secure a visionary urban farm in the East Phillips community, and to stop the city from building that massive polluting public works facility. He is also the future mayor of Minneapolis, as I like to call him. Just kidding. So yeah, Nick, if you could start us off with an overview of the Red Deal, that would be great.
Thanks so much, Nazir, for inviting me, and to the Twin Cities DSA for hosting this event. I've been speaking with several of you on the streets here and there about doing something about this, and or just giving a talk about the Red Deal. So I really appreciate the invitation, and I think I'm just going to do some broad brushstrokes about what the Red Deal is and what it isn't, but also how it could be applicable to movement spaces, because fundamentally it's a movement document. I didn't write it, I'll just be honest with you. It was like a collective of us that wrote it, and we debated back and forth about whether or not we wanted to attribute authorship. But if you've read the book, or if you have a copy of it in front of you, each of these sections was written by like a focus group. So we did a series of community meetings, mostly in the Southwest, even though we invited some of our relatives from up north, from the No DAPL struggle, to come and help facilitate some discussions. Most of this was written by Indigenous organizers in the Southwest. And so it kind of has that orientation a little bit. So I apologize, we're not trying to be narrow nationalists or narrow regionalists, but I do think there are broader implications to the struggle. Or to this document. It's also not in some ways it's not like a counter to the Green New Deal. Some people call it the Red New Deal, which is kind of funny because there's nothing new about it. Because I think a lot of the stuff that we've been drawing on in this particular pamphlet is just really a re-articulation or rewording or a reformatting of demands made by Indigenous movements for the last couple centuries since colonization started. But I'll be really honest with you, that the kind of beating heart and soul of this document comes from the 2010 or 2011 People's Accords that were drafted in Cochabamba, Bolivia. And so before you praise this book, go and read the People's Accords, because it's far more advanced in some ways, and I think far more visionary. And this is in many ways just a kind of like a North American articulation in some ways of the kind of premise of that particular document. So I really encourage everyone who's listening to go and check out, or watching, or however you're interacting, to go and check out the People's Accords, because that came out of a social movement, a successful social movement that actually captured state power. And I know there's a lot of conversations around this in various movement spaces around the question of state power and what that looks like. Bolivia is a much different kind of circumstance or context, especially when it comes to the state. They have a different history of colonialism. They have a different demographic population in terms of a majority indigenous state than the United States, where the United States is fundamentally settler colonial and has really formed not because of indigenous people, but in spite of them and in spite of indigenous sovereignty. So what we see in the current moment, like right now, especially, I think we might feel like we're in kind of a lull. There was a high point for at least the last decade in indigenous movement spaces. And I think if we look at the anti-extractive movements, we see a lot of sort of momentum kind of building in those spaces. And just to kind of put some hard numbers on this, because oftentimes as academics, especially in the humanities, we talk a lot about decolonization or these big buzzwords, but what does it actually mean to everyday people? And I think the biggest, the most concrete number that I can assign this is, if you indigenous-led movements in North America, or I should say in Canada and the United States, account for challenging a quarter of greenhouse emissions from Canada and the United States, two of the largest per capita emitters. So if you put that into context, there was a report. These numbers come from a report by the Indigenous Environmental Network that came out, I believe, in 2021. They might be a little bit skewed now. Biden has approved, the Willow Project in Alaska. So, but these are being challenged. They're not necessarily movements that have been successful in stopping the extraction of carbon or fossil fuels. Or the transportation, but it's looking at 10 different sites over a decade of struggle. And that's just 10 sites. That's not even accounting for other struggles, around the world, or other kind of smaller indigenous-led struggles against, carbon extraction or transportation. So that's a pretty powerful number, right? And so if we think about this in the context of the fossil fuel industry, that's a lot of money. If we look at the tons of carbon that have been prevented from being emitted, that actually correlates with profits that have been prevented from being realized. So we see this kind of recalcitrant state backlash, but also a legal political backlash. We can see that now playing out. I don't know if anyone has been following the controversy surrounding Deb Haaland, the first Indigenous woman to lead the Department of Interior. She's being attacked from the right by especially industry people in the Congress, but also the fossil fuel industry, because her daughter Soma is an organizer with Pueblo Action Alliance. We used to roll with them back in the day in Albuquerque. Actually, some of them helped write this book, but Soma didn't. So we're not going to be part of a congressional investigation, unfortunately. But they're going after her for alleged conflicts of interest because she's tied to this indigenous-led environmental group in the Southwest. It's based out of Albuquerque and led entirely by Pueblo women, young Pueblo women. So it's quite fascinating because Deb Haaland came into office, was appointed sort of, promising when she was a congresswoman for New Mexico that she would work to end fossil fuel extraction on federal lands. But if anyone's been paying attention to the news, we see that the Biden administration has actually allowed more drilling and exploration on federal lands than the Trump administration. So these, even if you look at the numbers, of like drilling and oil production and gas production on federal lands compared to the Biden administration, the Trump administration, the numbers don't really reflect this kind of radical environmental agenda. What actually represents the threat is an Indigenous woman who is, by association, related to these Indigenous-led environmental movements. And it's created such a backlash that even Indigenous nations themselves have come out in a weird sort of alliance with these fossil fuel industry and lobbyist perspectives. So just yesterday, for example, when Deb Haaland was going to give a speech about creating a buffer zone to stop fracking or to stop and create a moratorium on new fracking rigs around Chaco Canyon, which is a World Heritage Site. It's a site of emergence, and it's a creation site for many Indigenous nations, including the Pueblo nations down there, as well as some of even parts of Navajo Nation. There was a backlash from the Navajo Nation that was actually led by Boone Nygren, who is the Navajo Nation president. He called for peaceful protests, said Deb Haaland wasn't welcome within Navajo Nation borders because she was taking away money from allottees who stand to benefit ostensibly from oil and gas leasing on their lands because of this buffer zone around Chaco Canyon, because the Eastern Agency of the Navajo Nation is in proximity to. And so what has happened in this particular moment, we go from this moment of, the age of the water protector, right? Where Standing Rock inaugurates a new kind of moment of resistance and a new possibility, right? To kind of break the back of the fossil fuel industry and its stranglehold on the planet, to an era in which, we look at right-wing backlash and the backlash from the fossil fuel industry as kind of waging a new class war, even within Indigenous communities themselves. Because if we look at this particular situation, we have to think about it historically. And I'm a historian, first and foremost. If we look at this situation historically, the Navajo Nation has actually attempted in the past to nationalize its oil and gas industry, much like Bolivia has attempted to nationalize its oil and gas industry, much like Ecuador, much like Venezuela has nationalized their natural resources, specifically fossil fuels. And while the North, we might have this kind of initial knee-jerk reaction against that to say, hey, fossil fuels are bad, what movements from the South have taught us is that when you nationalize these industries and you redistribute the profits to the actual people where the resources are being extracted, you get a much different set of outcomes because they're setting the standards for extraction. Because today we cannot end extraction. Like if we ended extraction, oil and gas extraction, the world simply would collapse and a lot of people would probably go hungry, right? So instead of outsourcing the risks and the costs of energy in transition from a carbon extractivist economy, fossil fuel economy, to one in which ostensibly would be a green, socially just economy, that requires a lot of infrastructure to be built and a lot of social programs to be put in place. And so in one sense, when these allottees blockaded Deb Haaland, in some ways they were responding. There was kind of a class impulse to say, hey, why are you taking money out of our pocket? Why do we have to shoulder the burden of transition, or this, what they're calling the radical environmental agenda? But in the past, when the Navajo Nation has actually tried to nationalize its oil and gas industry under the administration of Peter MacDonald, he was trying to actually implement environmental regulations and standards to build roads, to take, to actually put money back into social services, to create elderly programs, to create housing programs, to create scholarship and education programs. And in fact, today, the Navajo Nation uses some of its oil revenue for those purposes. But in this situation, under this kind of, unregulated land grab and oil and gas extraction that's happening in the Eastern Agency, what somebody like Boone Nygren is actually fighting for is the right for Navajo people to be exploited at a higher rate, meaning that the returns that they get on these leases are actually diminishing because there's no attempt to rein in the oil and gas industry or to make them more accountable or to implement environmental regulations. It's just an argument for increased extraction. And the reason why I'm bringing up this particular example is because it sounds really complex, especially to the outside world. You might see a lot of people don't even interact with Native people on a daily basis. So why should you care what's happening in the Navajo Nation? Why should you care about a place like the Navajo Nation? Because it is an energy sacrifice zone for the rest of the country. And Biden even made this argument when he was talking about native lands and on the Arctic slope, saying that we need to open these lands up for oil and gas extraction and drilling because we are strong arm robbing the Russian market right now because we've implemented sanctions and forced Europeans to wean themselves off of Russian oil and gas. So he's essentially entered us, whether or not you believe that this is a NATO proxy war, doesn't even matter because the Biden administration is already seeing it as an energy war. The same way, in the same instance that the Obama administration saw sanctions against Venezuela, which has the largest oil reserves in the world, as an energy war to produce an impetus to produce more domestic energy, more oil and gas at the expense of Indigenous people. Under Biden's administration, fracking and domestic oil and gas production increased 80%. And it coincided with strategic sanctions against Venezuela's oil industry, right? So when we talk about the geopolitics of the Ukraine war and the energy crisis happening in Europe, it directly impacts and implicates Indigenous people. We're caught in the middle, right? So when we talk about the Navajo Nation, this kind of like what seems like an internal, struggle is actually one that could be extrapolated to a kind of global class struggle happening at a small scale. And this is why something like the Red Deal is so incredibly important, because it offers ways of advancing policy that's coming from below that doesn't normalize the kind of, or envision a kind of future where these kind of settler extractive economies just continue to sacrifice Indigenous nations for the energy needs and consumption of North America and the first world, right? So this is really the kind of premise of this, right? And I think when we look to kind of bring it back to like Bolivia, we can think of Bolivia as sort of in the imaginary of the United States, according to its Monroe Doctrine, as kind of like it's treating it like an Indian reservation, or it has treated it like an Indian reservation, where we want to extract raw material, whether it's gas in the first instance or lithium in the second instance for green energy that's unrefined. Because once Bolivia goes down the path of producing its own lithium supplies and creates its own batteries, it's adding value to it. So that means more profits and revenue go back to Bolivia. And people like Elon Musk don't get to realize the kind of profits that they would normally realize after selling, the electrification of cars, the electrification of the energy grid, according to green renewables and so forth, right? So these are incredibly important questions that we have to answer, and there are solutions to these problems. And while we lay them out, kind of like strategically within this book, one thing that I think a lot of folks forget when they read this book, and this is what this book isn't. And I kind of told you a little bit about the bigger ideas of what it is, but what it isn't is just having these correct kind of policy frameworks doesn't actually change anything, right? Because even getting somebody like Deb Haaland into this position, God bless her for being in the position that she's in, because it's a historic position. And in fact, it's historic for her own people because her as an Indigenous woman, as a Pueblo woman from the Laguna Pueblo, can't even hold office in her own tribal government because of their own restrictions on women holding public office. But she's now holding a cabinet level position, right? So that's incredibly historic. And she was also at Standing Rock, and she's been an advocate, a strong advocate for or against, I guess, the fossil fuel industry in other instances, maybe not so much in her current position, but nonetheless has been a strategic ally in the past. But having a politician alone isn't enough to change anything, right? Because only social movements can do what politicians can't do. And I think that's what we really lack. This is where we can't have a one-to-one comparison. Despite the colonial situation, the differences in the colonial situation in the United States and Bolivia, the other kind of situation that's different between Bolivia and the United States is that we don't actually have a mass movement on the left to really push and hold our elected officials accountable, or do we have grassroots kind of movement people in these elected positions? We do have at a local level here and there, but at a national level, we don't really have the numbers that we need, nor do we have the kind of the strength to push those things forward. So part of what this book doesn't do is it doesn't create social movements. What creates social movement? Things like the struggle against the demolition of the Roof Depot, that creates social movements. That centers Indigenous issues in a kind of broader class-based struggle. It united various communities. In one instance, we see that as well in the Southwest around fracking. You had different communities kind of coming together because their only alternative for economic development was allowing an outside oil company to essentially damage their water supply and forever destroy their land. They were basically selling their entire livelihoods and their future generations just so that they could eke out a form of living. So what the Red Deal really kind of promotes is a policy framework that is only useful when there's a social movement attached to it. And I think a place like Minneapolis, the Twin Cities, is very ripe and has, I'm kind of an outsider, but I'm also kind of, from their region, but not really from here. I'm still kind of getting my head around this whole Minnesota nice thing. This, the liberalism of settler colonialism and genocide here is really kind of fascinating because it is more complete in terms of the Ochete Xalcoy and actually more celebrated than even in a place like South Dakota, where you have the Wounded Knee Massacre, right, which is home to a very right-wing reactionary state government, but yet it doesn't quite celebrate genocide the way that Minnesota celebrates genocide. So I think there are a lot of obstacles that have to be overcome, especially in the Minnesota context. But I do see a lot of hope, and I see a lot of grassroots organizing happening, especially in the city, because these aren't, to be a water protector doesn't mean that you have to just be out on the land. Being a water protector, I saw a lot of water protectors at Little Earth. I saw grandmothers. I saw, people of all walks of life who aren't necessarily even Indigenous, take up that responsibility and say, hey, we want a better future for our children. And they're also air protectors, I guess. I don't know if we want to get into the whole airbender kind of. I don't read anime, so I don't really know about that. But that's also something that's worth kind of understanding. But at the end of the day, I think this is where I'll wrap it up with, is that where I see something like the urban farm kind of playing a huge role in a lot of this is it's not just defining what you're against. Sure, we're against this kind of pollution, the kind of targeted sacrifice zones that happen within a city. We're against, the fossil fuel industry as being the only alternative for any kind of energy or any kind of future. But we're also for community agriculture. We're also for local economies. We're also for jobs, green jobs that are actually meaningful to the communities that they come from. And not all jobs have to be bound up with extraction, but also you can have really good union jobs, kind of tied to this. So I think there's a lot to work on here in the city. There's a lot being done, and I'm just really excited. I'm more happy. I mean, this is a really dire time. You have two kind of like dinosaurs who are, trying to be president. We are in the middle of this proxy war. We're closer to nuclear Armageddon than we ever have been, probably since the 50s. But yet, there, at the local level, we have so much possibility and so much energy. So I'm really excited about that. So I'll turn it over to Joe to kind of pick up where I left off.
Yeah, let me frame the question for you, Joe. So I think you mentioned sacrifice zones, Nick, and I think that is what East Phillips is, the site where the roof depot exists, where they're trying to they were trying to build this massive public works facility. And also I think like the complexity of these developmental questions you alluded to a lot, and spoke to, and I think that is definitely in my mind as we imagine the next phase of this fight over the roof depot site, because I don't think it's over. I think it's we've won phase one. And so, but I wanted to I want to name that, Joe, because I maybe you could speak to that. I was hoping that we could get to that in this conversation, a little bit of like what the future is going to look like, the complexity of this fight. There's a discussion I was part of a week or so ago about where's the capital going to come from to for the roof, to develop the roof depot into an indoor urban farm. So these types of, is it going to be sourced from private capital? Is it going to be somehow gathered in a more democratic fashion? But I think first of all, if you could situate us, because something I've seen is I've observed and in different ways been involved in the roof depot fight for since 2018, I would say. And something I noticed is that as Indigenous leadership in the struggle increased, the power and legitimacy of the struggle increased, and ultimately was critical, the deciding factor in the victory that was just won. So yeah, maybe Joe, if you could explain, what is this struggle about, why you as an individual got involved, what compelled you about it, and also if you have thoughts about whether it embodies the principles and program of the Red Deal and how.
No, Chimigwich for the introduction, and I'm honored to be in space with you all. Buju, Wajin Wiju Adijanakas, Bigizi Dudadem, hello all my relatives. I'm South Mountain. My colonial name is Joseph Vital. I'm of the Eagle clan of the Red Lake Nation. So excited to be here in Nazir. Excellent questions. And so what we're dealing with here is a sacrifice zone that was created back in the 1930s. It was redlined and it was designated for industry. And Minneapolis intentionally placed all of its what they'd call undesirables in this area. So in the time, it was Eastern Europeans, Black individuals, but through the decades, immigrant populations have changed. However, the standard has remained the same. So up until today, what we're seeing is an undocumented Latinx community, the largest urban Indigenous population in the entire state, East Africans, refugees coming in from, colonial exploits across the world, and being situated here and being subjugated to some of the worst air quality in the entire state. I think North and South Minneapolis tend to compete with each other because they're both green zones, designated areas for, green energy development, pollution reduction, all of these things. However, the city of Minneapolis tends to ignore these morality clauses for the benefit of industry, and that's what we see today up to this point, where in East Phillips, for 8 years, the city of Minneapolis attempted to demolish the Roof Depot building, which was constructed in 1940, which was an extension of a pesticide plant where grasshopper pesticide was hauled off by rail, and in which large quantities of, the pesticide was, the main ingredient for it was arsenic, in which it was allowed to float onto the neighboring community, which exposed over 560 residents to this when the EPA eventually got involved in the 1990s. And so we're dealing with a 40-year gap of pollution that was allowed to just happen, and cleanup didn't even start taking place until the 2000s. So we're dealing with a place that was just allowed to diminish for the benefit of industry, Bituminous roadways is allowed to operate there just because they are grandfathered in, which basically means they can ignore MPCA standards of today. If you drive down 30 Cedar Avenue, once you cross 28th, you can smell the pollution in the area. And the income levels are also low, about 33,000 for a family in the area. And so we're dealing with a highly diverse, very poor area with income levels dropping to about $10,000 a year for folks who live in Little Earth. That was aforementioned by Nick Estes. And, what this is about, and it's kind of related to your third question, in how does it embody the Red New Deal, in which none of the things the East Phillips Urban Farm Project is new and groundbreaking technology or even visionary, but it's visionary in the scope of it's being implemented and led by community. And so the folks that have been spearheading the East Phillips Urban Farm Project is the East Phillips Neighborhood Institute, which is a grassroots land liberation organization that was founded back in 2015. And essentially they advocate for the liberation of land, Native people, and all relatives on Turtle Island from capitalistic exploit and colonial intervention. And, EPNI is most commonly connected to the Urban Farm Project, but before we get into the components of this, I want to keep in people's mind that what we want is more than just the ground. We don't want a piece of paper. What we want is to heal the land, and in return for it to heal us. And this is all part of that. Community control for the benefit of people and the land, both past and future, because we're working with future relatives in the protection of land for the next 7 generations. And what the Urban Farm Project is a multi-use development project that consists of, an indoor urban farm that fresh fruits and vegetables would be grown year-round, hydroculture, aquaculture, where fish poop would essentially fertilize the very plants that we'd grow there, in a closed system where we could grow year-round. Community kitchen, cultural markets, and public space such as classrooms, such as event space, because for anybody who's ever organized anything in the Twin Cities, public space for meetings is at a premium. Sometimes you have to wait weeks just to get a room, and then the cost on top of all of that. And this all came about in 2015 when neighbors in East Phillips got word that the city of Minneapolis was going to purchase and demolish the Roof Depot building, after relatives in the neighborhood had been working with the owner of the site at the time for a purchase. And there was a verbal agreement of around $5 million, but the city threatened eminent domain and forced a sale and increased the price to $6.8 million, which was the closing cost. And since then, it's just been a grassroots fight for control of this site. And what we've come and led to is, the eventual agreement of the sale of the site. And that's good context to how we got here. It was all based on a lie from the city. A lie it tried to sell time and time again to the neighbors of East Phillips that its project would eventually benefit them or will benefit them directly. They lied about jobs. They lied about the pollution impacts, which its own EAW explained that pollution traffic would increase by upwards of 150% in the morning. And that's from the vehicle. And that's a good reminder of what exactly was the city's project that they wanted to build there, and why was it problematic. And it was, what the city's project was, to consolidate all of its public works facilities. And if you look across the city, they've all been built in what is now trendy neighborhoods that the city is trying to free up for developers to start building condos and other commercial artsy bourgeois projects that benefit their type of people, the yuppies. And they want to bring these fleets of hundreds of diesel trucks into this neighborhood that is poor, that is highly, that is majority BIPOC. So this is just kind of environmental racism 101. And East Phillips having some of the worst asthma rates, this would only exacerbate the issue. And there's no comparison between what the community wants, which is this indoor urban farm project versus the city's project, because in the city's own words, its racial equity impact analysis, the only benefit of its project was going to be the update and reconstruction of its stormwater system in the area, and the fact that they wouldn't be able to develop this thing, versus them admitting that pollution levels would agree. So it's in the city's own words that this is just fucked. It's not okay. And it led to 8 years of conflict. And that's where I come in. So same as you, Nazir, in 2018 is when I got involved. And at the time, I was part of the DFL establishment as its Native Peoples Caucus chair at the time. However, my involvement came when Cassandra Holmes and Jolene Jones, who were two of my directors at the time, who came up and said, you need to focus on this. This is happening in your own backyard and not enough is happening. And so I started going to EPNI meetings. And I remember one meeting that completely shocked me, which was between Cassandra Holmes, Karen Clark, and Andrea Jenkins. And in this meeting, they're trying to lobby Andrea Jenkins. And Jenkins just flat out says, well, what do you want? Clean air or clean water? Because if we don't build our site in East Phillips, Minneapolis won't have clean water. And I must have been wet around the ears. I was just floored, shocked. And I just told Cassie, I'm in. What else do you need from me? And at the same time, I know Indigenous people, especially those who go to higher ed, and it's also something embodied in our value system, is that whatever we do is for the benefit of the tribe or the people, the planet. And so this not only was this an issue that angered me, but one that felt right. And so since then, I've been a lead organizer in this movement, and it's had its ups and downs, clearly. But I always say I've never done anything that's made me feel more alive. And does this project embody the principles of the Red New Deal? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we advocate for the divestment of the police and relocating those dollars not only to projects like the indoor urban farm project, but those across the city that benefit communities of color in our cultural corridors. What we see is a divestment of those and into the police. It's the opposite of what we need. We're also talking about the investment in our common humanity, and this is expressed in the community's project goals to create sustainable housing at those at 30% AMI, a healthy, sustainable food system that I expressed, clean water, land, and air, because we believe we can have all. Minneapolis always said, we have no idea where we're going to build our Hiawatha expansion project, if not here. It's bullshit. It's a large fueling station. It's a gas station. You can build that anywhere else. And when we struck this deal, oh shit, we can build this in Plymouth. We're moving right away. Suddenly they had plans. But back to the question, it's direct investment in our common future. The beautiful thing about this project is that it will be community owned and community controlled. And we've had mock exercises about how exactly that can play out, because at least politicians love to ask, prove it. And we had these exercises with community members, and this project would make $12 million a year as designed at this moment. And some of the ideas of what to do with that revenue from community was buy baby bonds, so that when future relatives are born in this neighborhood, they can be set up, whether it's a down payment for a home, money for school, or just money for exploration, because school isn't for everybody, funds to begin a trade, what have you. But it just showed that the community had the intelligence to not only develop this project that came together, but also develop and have a roadmap of what to do with the future dollars. And have maybe just one more thing to say in connection, with the Urban Farm Project, with the Red New Deal, is that it's just the protection of the land, protection of the four-legged and our plant relatives. There is a bumblebee that is facing extinction that resides in the neighborhood. We are protecting that directly by not allowing the Roof Depot building to fall and expose folks to the arsenic underneath, and starting to undo the toxic air pollution that has been allowed to develop in this neighborhood for decades. And this is just step one. We're going to continue these additional phases, because the next thing we have to look at, besides the development of the community vision, is Smith and Bituminous, which is around 20 acres of land that needs to be undone. And there's been a lot of victories at the state level that we'll get into and discuss how that fits in with the roadmap that other frontline communities have been advocating for and winning. And all this is connected. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, that's really tons of information and insights and history there. And yeah, I think I kind of want to move to like some of the history, and especially given that we have Nick here, who, as he says, is a historian and a precious historian of that in our movement. I think Our History in the Future was really compelling, powerful book. It's been informing how I approach and think about things. And yeah, I feel like when I think of the global situation, it's really depressing and overwhelming. And, I feel like extraction is only increasing, despite the climate emergency we're in. I feel like, all the fanfare around the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure, like all of, what Joe Biden has been up to, it's like, oh, climate emergency solved, US has got it. And all I see is this. I guess I'm stating very clearly my position on it. It's a distraction. The Willow Project proceeds forward, that there's pipeline projects that are proceeding, and I think, and then at the same time I look locally and I feel I'm filled with hope at this victory that we have here, and I think I'm still processing the local versus the global in a lot of ways. And I don't know, Nick, this is more for you, I guess, but Joe, if you have thoughts too. And I'm wondering, how do you, and so, yeah, one more thing I want to say about that is that, like, but what always helps me is history, like knowing that this is a long fight and struggle that we're part of, and it will continue long after any of us are around. And our job is just to carry the torch forward to the next person. And so I that always helps me. And so history is so important to our movements. And I'm wondering, especially as you engage, like as you've gotten more aware of this Roof Depot fight, have there been any like facts, events in the past, historical context that you've thought about or learned about, that you could provide for us to help us situate this struggle?
I can't think of it's hard, just because I was as Joe was talking, I was sitting there thinking, like, this divide in environmental politics around urban versus rural. It also plays out in how a lot of people view Indigenous people. Specifically, most people view Indigenous people as kind of being confined to like rural, isolated pockets of poverty. But in fact, even according to like the most recent census numbers, like 4 out of 5 Native people live off reservation. Most of them live in cities like Minneapolis. The difference, though, of like Minneapolis is compared to a place like, New York City, which has the highest urban Indigenous population, believe it or not, is that the urban Indigenous population in Minneapolis is much more concentrated and is organized. And this kind of gets to this question in the chat from Tess. What's the history of Little Earth being cited in this area? This Little Earth, and Joe can correct me if I'm wrong here, but he might have a little bit better knowledge. But from my understanding, it's kind of an outcome of the social movements in the 1960s and 70s, specifically the American Indian movement. Because East Phillips was originally a majority owner neighborhood, meaning that it was kind of I wouldn't say affluent, but it definitely was like, like middle class white folks who fled the city after World War II. And in fact, Minneapolis's population really sharply declined after World War II. And you saw all of this internal kind of like racist sentiment that the city's center, whether it was the north side, whether it was the south side, was becoming overrun with crime and poverty, meaning people of color, Native people, immigrants, etc. So over time, East Phillips became a majority renter neighborhood. And it's where a lot of Native people emigrated to. Not because it was never a relocation center, but post World War II jobs, were really concentrated in the city, and a lot of people just were trying to find employment. And the American Indian movement was really a catalyst, as well as a lot of the social programs happening in the city at that time. And one of those was Little Earth, which is low-income housing for, I think it's the only, actually, somebody said it's the only one, but I don't think that's true, because we have one in Rapid City. It's called Lakota Homes, which is a Section 8 housing unit specifically for Native American residents. But it's one of the few. And so I think that's important, because it's bringing Indigenous struggles to an urban context, because they've always been there to begin with, right? This land is called Badote. It's part of this broader cultural geography of Dakota people, the Ochete Shakoli, as well as, Ojibwe and Anishinaabe people. But this is, this idea that somehow there's these kind of neat dichotomies between urban and rural isn't really, I don't think, useful, to be honest, because even the kind of voting maps, you say, these urban areas are very blue, and then the rural areas are the wrong kind of red, right? Because we want the good kind of red, not the wrong kind of red. But if you look at like voting patterns on Indian reservations in the West, there's rural areas, they tend to vote left, right? So that doesn't even match up with the urban, rural divide. But I think, at the end of the day, like when we talk about these issues, like especially concentrating an urban land-based struggle, or a land-back struggle, or one that's looking for environmental justice, right? And we think about questions of, the police, right? That Joe brought up, because I think that's incredibly important. Like I can't remember how much the Minneapolis Police Department lost a lot of, officers who are now filing for PTSD claims and getting disability, which is kind of ironic. They get PTSD from enacting trauma on people, which is really ironic, and collecting benefits from it. But we see a decline in the number of officers, but also a decline in the number of crime. So it makes you ask, what exactly are cops doing? Like, what are they doing? So you have too many cops, or you have enough, quote unquote, enough cops, and crime is on the rise, but then you don't have enough cops, and crime is on the decline. So it really begs the question of, what are you doing? And I think that's it's hard to look at recent city politics, it's hard to tell everyday people that, hey, you should abolish the police or this is a good idea, because people don't eat ideology. And that was a term and a phrase that I learned when I was in Venezuela. It's like, you can have these high ideals about things, but at the end of the day, are you meeting people's basic needs? And I think that's really what the urban farm, but this movement represents, is like, it's an alternative. It's not just saying we're going to try to negate, the police, but it's saying that community safety is actually about having food security. Security doesn't just mean protection from bodily harm, right? Security actually also means, where are you getting food? Do you have adequate housing? Why aren't those security issues? Why isn't that about community safety as well? Because when we go into that neighborhood, we see the city is so ready to evict people who don't have homes, but then it goes and funds the police. It doesn't make any sense, and then it calls it a community safety issue. It's like, what about the safety of the people who are living on the street? Why is that never a question? And why is housing not the first prerogative, but police are? So.
Great, thanks. Yeah. I don't know if Joe, if you have anything else to add to that.
Yeah, just clarity. And I love the setup and the question, especially about Little Earth and talking about the history of Phillips. Yeah, Phillips was a majority homeowner neighborhood. However, it was split in 2005 because of, it's been an environmental justice fight for almost 100 years, 50, very direct, with the construction of Hiawatha through the neighborhood to bring the eventual shutdown of Roof Depot because it was still handling those pesticides, and there was a whistleblower in working with community to actually get that to get it shut down, and as a result of the county citing this company upwards of millions of dollars. It's unclear to me how much it was cited for, because they were dumping the arsenic into the ground and other chemicals. But this was power. Oh, and there was a garbage burner that was proposed to be built. I mean, it was built. You could see the stack right across from the cemetery, but it was going to go in full operation. And so in seeing this, the community separated the city separated the community in 2005 from Greater Phillips to East Phillips. And from there, and this was strategically done because in the 1970s, that's when Little Earth was, built and went into operation in 1980s. And this was a result of AIM fighting back of, you tricked our people off the reserve. I mean, that's how I ended up here, because my grandfather was promised a job and, housing when he came to Minneapolis. And what did he find? Not shit, but homelessness and alcoholism at one point. And so this truth is intentionally seen in the design of East Phillips. And that's how we get a community that has very little to fight back, but continues to fight back. And even resulted in, Nick was talking about, not having enough representatives at a national level, but at one point we had a strong ally at the House, Karen Clark, shout out to her. And it's a big reason why community was up in arms about a new fight that was coming, the proposed Hiawatha expansion project, because in 2008, Karen Clark created a unique cumulative impacts bill specific for East Phillips, where with new construction, there must be a cumulative impact analysis. But the city found a loophole through that, which is what Ethne took the city to court for, which is this bill doesn't cover emissions that is created by vehicles, because it's moving emissions. Therefore, it should be spread out. However, it's consolidated in the area because you have trucks idling by. And so with all this being said, just some clarification, some additions to, what Nick said. It was always intentional. It was always intentional by the elite to create this sacrifice zone, because initially you had undesirables, but then they came to own land. And so you had to break that power up, because owning land in this country is the biggest connection to power. You know, who do politicians listen to? Homeowners. That's what they care about. And that's how you get to this fuckery. But what we'll learn in a little bit is, how do you fight back as renters, as folks in Section 8 housing, as allies, as relatives in this struggle? Thank you.
So we have about half an hour left, and I think we are wanting to, like, the folks who asked me to moderate this, and myself included, like, also hear from those who are here. I know a lot of folks here. Many of them are very active, and there are some key folks in this meeting who helped get Twin Cities DSA to put forward a resolution and adopt that resolution to throw down for this fight, for this Roof Depot fight. And so, you know, I initially was thinking with this question of asking you two, but I would really love to hear from others who are present. Having heard all this, why is it important for leftists to throw down for environmental justice, for socialists to throw down, and for Indigenous struggles in particular? So I'm just gonna open it up, and maybe you folks want to come onto video and come off mute. Let's make this a little more interactive. But I would love to hear. I'm going to start calling on people if I don't, because I know some of y'all. I know you had roles to play. Yeah, get on Stack. That might be a good way to do it. Also, if somebody wants to just come off mute to start, that would be. How about you, Connor? Why didn't you tell us why? You just got so red all of a sudden. No pressure. No pressure.
Oh
Yeah,
man.
go ahead. Yes.
I'll try to be brief because I'm very pink at the moment, but yeah, I mean, I think to me, one thing that I don't have a cogent thought, but partly, you know, it's about getting at countering the kind of the fundamental underlying oppressive structures of the US, and like settler colonialism is one of those, and anything that undoes that seems like really vital. And I think also place-based struggles are really good at connecting a lot of issues that are often separated, like housing and environment, climate and jobs, and I think, yeah, you all have talked about this so well, but just the combination of the no and the yes of this struggle was just so huge that there's a lot of mobilizing power in fighting against pollution and racism and all of that. And there's also a real vision here that can carry it forward. So those are some things that come to mind.
Thanks. That was very cogent. Anyone else? I mean, I can put it another way too. I feel like I've been active in the chapter for, I don't know, several years now. And 2019, maybe? No, 2018. Yeah. And actually one of the first things the reason I joined the chapter was because we did an action on the Super Bowl calling for US Bank to divest from fossil fuel infrastructure, and DSA threw down. So my journey with DSA began with environmental justice. But I'm also curious, you know, what for those in DSA especially, but others here too, like what has this struggle over Roof Depot. What impact has it had on the chapter? How has it changed the way we do things in DSA? How has it informed our work? I would love to hear. We could also do breakouts if this is just too much pressure, but let me know. Go ahead, Deb.
Can you go hear me? I'm
Yeah.
on my fancy headphones here.
Loud and
I don't
clear.
have that little mouthpiece in front of my mouth. It's like magic. So I'm like one of the oldest members. I've been in Twin Cities DSA, not continuously, but since 1986. And it's great hearing all this neighborhood new history. The parts I was part of and the parts I was in another country during, that was really great. But your question, has it changed how Twin Cities DSA organized? Can't really answer that, because everything from 2015 till now, it hasn't been continuous enough to map any change, if you see what I mean. It's just been always changing. So in other words, for it to be a big turnaround change, it would have to have been a tradition built up of how we organize. But I think it stands out as one of our most successful, if you count success as people being able to work within their truth while they're organizing. Because a lot of times, people are starting a new project and they're doing something like door knocking or canvassing or polyed or graphics or making signs for a march. And there isn't this real sense of connection with people outside of DSA and with what we're actually doing and the results we're going to get. And this struggle was more connected, more end-to-end, more organic, a lot more connections were made outside of Twin Cities DSA itself through this, through working and organizing on this. So it was a departure, but it wasn't really like a conscious change, like we started doing things differently. It was just some doors opened up that had frustratingly been closed before. And then on top of that, when we actually got a victory, which seemed to come out of nowhere almost, and be statewide news and even international news, that just was like the icing on the cake. So, I think it's been a great thing for the chapter. And I hope we continue going on in this way, doing this kind of, not only this project, but similar projects. I think it shows people the possibilities of neighborhood-based local organizing.
Thanks, Deb. Yeah, that's very insightful. Kip?
There we go. That as a chapter, you hear. Can you hear me?
You're a little
Anybody?
connection's a little weak, Kip.
Okay, I'll shut that off. That should be helpful. Hopefully help.
Yeah, that's better.
So, okay, I was going to say this is a really conscious effort on DSA's part to, I think I'm still kind of somebody else. Okay. Anyhow, we
Maybe we go to Brooke.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if my connection went unstable, but Brooke, maybe if you can go and then Kip, if you can find a better spot. Go ahead.
Hey y'all, I'm Brooke. I'm one of the co-chairs of GCDSA's labor branch in the Political Education Committee. And I kind of want to answer like the first question that you asked, Nazir, like why should leftists become involved in environmental justice fights? And I think that Nick, you alluded to some of this before, but like all of the different elements that environmental justice fights bring in together, like it brings in people who are worried about the land and climate. It brings in people who are concerned about land ownership and land sovereignty. It also brings in labor questions and, you know, international energy wars and proxy wars. Like it brings in all of these different factors. And I'm also a nurse, so it brings in that kind of health aspect as well. So I think environmental justice fights, and particularly this one, we saw bring in a lot of different groups and a lot of different people from different areas and with different interests. And I think that's the power of environmental justice fights. Also, in all of us learning more about, you know, Indigenous resistance and Indigenous struggle was a huge part of that. And just important for people on the left, because I think too often like liberals and people who are like baby lefties can be caught up in like green transition stuff that really caters to the middle class and doesn't question any of these ideas of ownership and redistribution of wealth and all of these other factors that I just mentioned. So I feel like that's what this fight really did for us as a chapter as well. It helped us realize all of those connections and realize that those connections can be easily made because a lot of people care about a lot of these different things and can be brought in to struggle together. And that is, I think, what helped this struggle come to this conclusion of a victory, that all of these people were organized and brought together to fight for a singular thing.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for that. I don't know if Kip, you want to try again? Otherwise, I would love someone to answer the question that Spencer raised, which is, how did the resolution happen? I know it was a long process, but concisely. Anyone feel? Connor, go ahead. Yeah.
I could try it quickly, but basically I think last year the chapter was coming up with like, we want to be more focused as a chapter and pick a few issues to kind of like throw down on. And yeah, it just and I had kind of intermittently been involved in some of the Roof Depot stuff since 2021 and in some earlier DSA stuff. And so I was, yeah, a few of us were talking, and it just, with all the shit that went down in 2022 with the city council doing like a total 180 where they approved the new thing, like they approved the urban farm in the spring, and then they didn't have 9 votes, and then Fry was like, JK, I'm going to veto it, and then did some BS, and then fast forward to the fall where the city council approved demolition. It was like, okay, this is going to blow up potentially. And so we just put forward basically a resolution that this should be one of the things to focus on as a chapter. And it also made some sense because there were a lot of strategic electoral fights, like with Andrea Jenkins and Andrew Johnson and other things, where this could be a wedge issue, which it turned out to be. And so I think it was kind of looking at the current strengths of the chapter, and then this fight could kind of unite all of those things together so that it could get the whole chapter working around one thing. That's at least how I would see it.
Great, thanks, Connor. Go ahead, Kip / Cynthia.
There you go. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, fundamentally, the resolution that we passed at our convention in 2022 was about power. And I'm really glad that Nick talked about the fact that if electoral power isn't connected to mass movement and working class power, then you have nothing. And so we obviously electoral power can be very important, but only if it's intertwined with mass movement, with unions, with mutual aid, et cetera. And so we as a group want to be part of helping to get the working class as a whole wielding power to save the earth, fundamentally. And the Red Deal, I mean, I remember Nazir 2 or 3 years ago said, "Hey, you got to read the Red Deal." And I was like, "Yeah, sure." People suggest all sorts of books. Then I read it, and it like blew my brain out of its socket. And just explaining the connection to the historic fight of Indigenous people against colonialism, et cetera, to creating a new world. And so that's what we're down with. That's what we wanted to do with the resolution, with electing a new leadership, to take power very seriously. And I think Joe has done a tremendous job in terms of melding all those parts of power together, or being a extremely important figure in terms of doing that. And so that's part of what we want to throw down around. And now, I mean, you can begin to get a glimmer of, like Nazir, you were saying, how sometimes you get depressed about the world, but you can begin to get a glimmer of how a successful struggle in a little tiny neighborhood that has no political power wins a victory, can roll that up into other victories and start to be a significant example to people throughout the country. So I think that's kind of the history of where DSA's involvement came with all of this. Is I don't want to float down the lazy socialist river, and talk about things. I like talking about things. Obviously, I'm talking a lot right now, but I want to change the world, and I want to engage with other fighters, like everybody on this Zoom call, to do that. And so that's why we got involved in this, and it's been a tremendously good experience. And now we got the Herc and some other fights that we can stand on the shoulders of EPNI and Urban Farm. So I will shut up.
Great, thank you, Kip. That's very wise, and you tied a lot together there. Ricardo, why don't you go next?
Hi, I can't speak from the perspective of DSA because I'm not in DSA, but I would like to offer some thoughts about the movement and the struggle around the urban farm. And there's a lot of lessons to learn, I think, but the one that I want to focus on is perseverance, which, if anything, is the bedrock of Indigenous resistance since the time of the invasion, is that you maintain a rhythm of struggle no matter what, right? And even when, I mean, any movement that you dig into the history of, or almost all, you'll hear about those times when it seemed that actually nothing was going right. And there was seemed very little chance of success. And the only reason we know about those movements is because people stuck with it. And even at times when the strategy is not clear, you don't really know what to do, the default is just keep doing. Even just use tactics if you don't have strategy, and that buys time. That creates the space within into which new allies can step, new clarity can develop. Groups have been part of this effort that have dropped out. Other groups, including DSA, have joined in, each bringing new energy, and that allowed for an opening for the street action to develop, especially with Littler stepping in. That created leverage to be able to reach out to allies in the legislature who have power over the city and use that power to force the city's hand, essentially. So that's really all I want to say, is that the simple principle of sticking with it, because what the elite wants more than anything else in this struggle is for us to go away. And they try all kinds of things, and they try confusing us. And the principle is, even when we're confused, we just keep going. And that does not guarantee that we'll win, but it's the only thing that will create the possibility of winning if those opportunities really exist in the world.
Thanks, Ricardo. Wise words. And shout out Paula, also another critically important. Speaking of persistence, I know you've been there for many years fighting this fight too. I think Cynthia, is that Kip back on stack? Go ahead.
No, it's me. Cynthia, she, her. And I just wanted to say that one of the things that I feel like we learned in DSA is how to play nice with others, like we're in coalition. And so we had to, and it was really interesting to see how everybody contributed something different, and it was all valuable, and each group had a different focus. Like for me, a big turning point was, and I have only been involved since January and mainly on the comm side of things, but for me, a big turning point was the occupation, that 24 hours or so. And that was like direct action. And that was the, American Indian movement. And that was Little Earth. And then, DSA did different things, but there are people who are more focused on direct action. And it was really great to see how every group, every individual brought something a little bit different, but it was all essential. And so those differences, I think there's a tendency sometimes to judge other groups or other efforts and compare them to what you do and your ideology. And I think that was a great example of how everybody brings something valuable. And we need to learn how to pass those differences and work together despite those differences. And that's the only way we're going to win. So I think the environmental movement is really exciting because of that, and because of its explicit anti-capitalist focus on the energy, because what bigger capitalists can you think of? So and putting Indigenous people and the Indigenous wisdom of interrelation, the non-extractive, the non-power over, the kind of relationship, in good relationship with rather than power over, that's such an important kind of philosophical, spiritual orientation that socialists need to adopt. So I don't think we got enough of that, which is one of the reasons I'm so excited about the Red Deal, is that that centers that ideology. And I hope, for me, this work is very spiritual. And I love that the Red Deal focuses on that and might help some socialists. You know, some of us are very, I mean, all of us probably are very oriented to neoliberalism because that's the world we live in. It's a capitalist world we live in. And I think the notion of interdependence and how we're all connected and dependent on one another is really important. And we can stand to learn some more about that. So thanks for doing this presentation.
Thank you, Cynthia. And actually, I want to shift it back to close to Joe and Nick. And I think that brings up something for me, which is like one of the things, Joe, that I observed with you is speaking of coalitions, that you held together, not just you, but you played a very, very critical role in holding together a very diverse coalition of actors across the political spectrum, in the, you know, elected power, outside of those deeply skeptical of electoral power. And so, yeah, I just wanted to name that. But I think the other, you know, and you are willing to bring leftists in. I think I don't want to name that you may have leftist orientation and call you out as a socialist. I'm not even sure if that's true, but I know you have some sympathies. And so one question I have for both of you is like, why is it important for Indigenous activists to engage with the left? And I think I say that as someone who participated in Line 3, where there was, again and again, I encountered a real skepticism towards leftist organizations. You know, Marx is a white dude. Why are we paying attention to Marx? And I mean, you know, that may be real basic, but it was an impediment. And yeah, I'm curious if y'all, because also I know obviously the Red Deal is very much a leftist document. And so if you have thoughts about that to close.
I'll kick it off so Nick can leave us in a good way, not leave y'all with my babbling. No, the truth is, you know, Indigenous people were not this perfect, angelical, connected group of individuals, and we need help. You know, we have a relation to the land. We have that connection that was, you know, our European relatives were dispossessed so long ago because they've been completely colonized and disconnected from the land. And in the example of the victory that we just got, we can't do things alone anymore. We need our allies, you know, high and low. You know, there were multiple factors that led to this victory. Little Earth was exemplified a second ago of when they stood up. However, it was in relation to a social movement that our allies had helped us co-create for years. This isn't something that happened overnight. As Little Earth held down, well, I don't want to implicate Little Earth. Allegedly, folks were holding down Roof Depot. They were being supplied by allies. There was a rich, you know, fast-moving network, and that couldn't have been done alone. And quite frankly, we're all facing this kind of 30-year clock of like climate destruction. And it's going to take all of us from all political fields, maybe not the super right, fuck them, but you know what I mean? It's not about who's more left. It's about who gives a damn, who has the time, and who's going to show up. And I'll leave it off with this is, it takes us all in movement, but also all of us chirping. Get the ears of media, get the ears of others. And that is why Indigenous people need to be in space with leftists.
Yeah, I guess like I'm on the left and I always will be on the left and I am a socialist. So I have no qualms about that because I am a, you know, I've been in this fight since at least, you know, since the early 2000s, and I came to consciousness around this stuff. And it's the most, you know, if you go back to Bolivia, it's the movement towards socialism that brought us the People's Accords, one of the most revolutionary, indigenous-centric documents of the rights of Mother Earth. When we talk about the rights of Mother Earth, that is a socialist framework that came from indigenous people in Bolivia, the second poorest country in this hemisphere. But they, you know, when Evo Morales, when he talks about why the United States government hates him so much, it's not just because he's an indigenous person. That has something to do with it. It's because he's also a trade unionist and an anti-imperialist and a socialist. All of those things, because he represents, it's not just him as an individual, but he represents a movement and an alternative to neoliberal capitalism and to climate change and climate catastrophe. And that's why, as Joe pointed out earlier, that's why they try to break up community land ownership, because it's a real power, you know, it's about building power. You know, that's really what socialism is. It's people power, fundamentally. Class is fundamentally about power. We can't be afraid of class. We have to build up our class so that we can win power and we can build power. That's the point, right? I think there's a tendency, a nihilist tendency in the United States. I won't name specific tendencies or political ideologies, but they tend to be more dominant, but they offer no alternative other than just resistance for resistance sake. But we're, you know, as Nazir pointed out earlier, this is a long-term struggle where we have to build power. And one thing that I think, you know, being indigenous is not enough. I mean, if we go back to even the groups that we named earlier and the movements we named earlier, like in the Navajo Nation, there are right-wing, you know, indigenous people. Being indigenous doesn't equal politics, right? If you look at the Congress, there are more indigenous senators and Congress people who are not just Republicans, but like far right, anti-union, you know, anti-Mexican, anti-Islamic, you know, Republicans. They are one step away from being fascist, right? Those are indigenous people. So we can't say, oh, we should turn to our indigenous representatives, because we actually need politics. And you don't have to be indigenous to understand the need for decolonization or socialism, right? You don't have to have a trauma-centered like identity. You don't even need to be a spiritual person, right? It's nice. You go to Brazil and you go to the movement towards socialism, or excuse me, the landless workers movement, the indigenous movements there. They're singing and dancing. There's a weird secularism in the United States on the left that I'm not quite sure I understand, just because all the major social movements that change history in this country are deeply grounded in spiritual traditions, whether it's the Black movement, the freedom movement, whether it's the indigenous struggle, right? But I think at the end of the day, like going back to like what Nazir said, and it makes me think of what one of my mentors, Madonna Thunderhawk, said, which she said, and she was asked by a student at University of New Mexico when she was giving a talk there, like, why did you sacrifice your life, your comfort? There's no retirement plan for a lot of these revolutionaries, right? They don't have benefits. But she was asked why she gave up this kind of life, you know, stability of, you know, even the relationships with her own family. Why would she do that? And she said, because I want to be a good ancestor to future generations. I want my descendants to look back and say, hey, this is an ancestor that we have, that we should fight for, and that we should look to as an example. Much like we have in the American Indian movement, the phrase "in the spirit of crazy horse," right? You know, we are fighting for gains that we will not even realize in our lifetime. And it's not nihilistic, but it's like, it's a temporal kind of kinship, right? A temporal relationship through time of future generations that we have not yet met, right? And you don't need to believe in creation or whatever it is to have that kind of commitment. Like, but it's a very Indigenous thing to be in relation to future generations, right? And I think that's something that we can all humble ourselves in sacrificing in this moment in time, that we can ensure the existence of life on this planet, right? In a future premised on justice, and a future premised on clean water, homes for everybody, quality food, right? Accessible healthcare. These are grounded in human values, not consumption, not extraction, right? These are founded in the very things that make us human beings, which is our social relations with each other and with the so-called natural world, right? And you don't need to be the Na'vi from Avatar, right, to understand that. But it's about creating the world in which we want to live.
All right, I know we're a few minutes over. I'm not gonna offer much more than that because that was really beautiful and well said. And yeah, if everyone could just, I don't know how we do it on Zoom, but a round of applause. Thank you so much to Nick and Joe for spending this time with us. Yeah, yes, that's a good one. Yeah, thank you. Thank you both so much. You are both an inspiration to me and happy to call you friends as well. So if we could, continue the fight. How to close, but it's not over. There's a lot more to go with East Phillips and with the Roof Depot. So this is, and also please join as we try to shut down the HERC. Put my own little point in there. We're getting close. We actually have a campaign update meeting tomorrow. And I think that's going to get shared on DSA socials. So look for that. But yeah, thank you all. Take care. Have a good night. Solidarity.
Take a Wamaman.